let's begin in the usual way. You're at home still, I take it, Mr. Waters, with your dog and partner.
I am indeed.
And you, Miss Richards, are in the hearing chamber in Fleetbank House.
Yes.
Can you give us a brief update on who is there?
The same as previously. We have Ms Fraser Butlin and myself from the council team, one member of the inquiry solicitor team, our document display engineer, and two members of the inquiry team to ensure the smooth running of the processes here.
And I remain at home. Yes.
Mr Waters, we looked yesterday as our last document at the Hemofact number 4 from 1984, written by Dr. Kernoff. Before I ask you about documents and events in the last part of 1984, there's some further general questions I want to ask you and a handful of 1983 documents to look at. First of all, you've told us about your dealings with the Department of Health in London. Given the Haemophilia Society was a UK-wide organisation, can you assist us with what interactions, if any, you had with the Scottish Home and Health Department?
Very little, and none that I can call to mind.
So there were no regular meetings in any event?
No.
Did the Haemophilia Society, as far as you can recall, have any correspondence with the Scottish Home and Health Department in the early 80s?
None that I recall, but of course remember at this time we were two staff.
And can you recall whether you ever had any dealings in the course of the 80s with the Welsh office or the Northern Irish office?
No recollection at all.
Secondly, we touched on Tuesday, I think, on the World Federation of Hemophilia, and you indicated that the Haemophilia Society had a relationship with and would liaise with some of the national haemophilia organisations.
Correct.
I wanted to ask you just specifically about the National Haemophilia Foundation in the United States. Would the society in 81, 82, 83 have been reasonably up to date with resolutions or announcements or decisions being taken by the National Haemophilia Foundation, do you think?
No, we would not.
So how...
Well, we didn't exchange minutes or anything like that, and it was more in the form of when we were able to meet that we exchanged information.
So there was no...
Communication, again, was not what it is now in those distant days.
So you would perhaps meet at the World Federation of Haemophilia Congress. You might meet representatives of the National Haemophilia Foundation at those Congress meetings?
Yes.
And then was there any system for any written exchange of information for documents of mutual interest to be shared?
That would all be done through the World Federation of Haemophilia itself, rather than directly with any national member organisation.
And then you told us about attending the UKHCDO annual general meetings, and you've already indicated to us that the Society didn't receive the minutes of those meetings afterwards. Did you, as far as you can recall, when you attended those meetings, you and your colleagues, were you given copies of the reports that were being talked about at the meeting? So if there was an update from Dr. Krask or a report of the Hepatitis Working Party or Home Therapy Working Party, would you be given copies of the materials that other attendees at the AGM had?
To the best of my recollection, no, we did not. We were there as observers rather than participants.
Can I then ask you to look at a handful of documents from 1983, which we didn't look at earlier in the week. One is a document which I hope was sent to you yesterday afternoon after we finished, so it's additional to the documents that we mentioned yesterday. I'm going to put it up on screen. If you haven't seen it, please let me know. It's CBLA 5060 _067, Shumik. And you'll see, Mr. Waters, it's a letter from Alpha Therapeutic dated the 16th of March 1983 to Professor Bloom. It draws his attention to and attaches a transcript of a press release issued by Alpha in January 1983. If we go over to the press release, Seamus, which I think is either on the next page or one, if the next page is blank, it's the page after. Thank you. So we can see here, this is the 7th of January 83 Alpha Therapeutics press release. The first paragraph refers to Alpha taking steps intended to protect haemophilia patients and other blood product users from AIDS, the deadly new epidemic. And it says Alpha has taken steps to exclude from its donor pool persons who may be at high risk of transmitting the disease to others. And then if we just go to the bottom half of the page, please, Seamus. The penultimate paragraph, Mr. Waters reads, the evidence suggests, although it does not absolutely prove, that a virus or other disease was transmitted to them being haemophiliacs infected with AIDS, in the factor VIII concentrate derived from pooled human plasma, which they rely on for life and for sustaining a relatively normal lifestyle. And then it goes on to refer to surveys being conducted by the National Haemophilia Federation, producing other disquieting findings. AIDS has jumped from the 7th to the 2nd most common cause of death in haemophiliacs within a year. The case rate appears to be rising. I don't think we need to look at the rest of it, but first of all, do you have any recollection of the Society receiving this document at the time?
Not at all. The other observation I would make immediately, which leaps off the page at me, is that in the United States, they didn't have a data collection system in the same way that we had in the United Kingdom through Oxford. And this was run by the National Haemophilia Foundation on a national basis. And as such, it didn't have the high status necessarily that one looked after by doctors would have. Like us, the NHF were not a huge organisation. They were a larger organisation, but not a huge organisation.
You told us yesterday, I think, about there having been a degree of liaison between the Society and pharmaceutical companies, at least through Mr. Milne's Blood Products Subcommittee. Given the Society's established relationships with pharmaceutical companies producing concentrates, is this something you would have expected the Blood Products Subcommittee to be aware of?
Not necessarily, because this was communication from a pharmaceutical company to doctors, and I think there was generally tiered communication.
Did the Society, as far as you can recall, even if it didn't see this specific document, have any awareness in 1983 that a commercial pharmaceutical company was warning publicly that its own product might transmit AIDS?
I have no recall of that at all.
Do you think this is something that Professor Bloom should have shared with you?
I think it's something that the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation, through Professor Bloom, should most certainly have shared with us.
And if the Society had seen this and seen, for example, Alpha itself saying the evidence suggests that the haemophiliacs infected in the States were infected as a result of the factor VIII concentrate they were taking, if you'd seen that, do you think that might have affected the Society's stance and its public message in the course of 83 and 84?
It could well have. And I know that Alpha product gained market share in the 80s. Whether it was directly related to this or what, I have no recall.
We can take that down, Seamus. The next document from 1983 I wanted to ask you to look at is this. Again, it's a document that's been sent to you recently. It may only have been yesterday. It's CBLA 40 sorry, CBLA 5043_040. Mr. Waters, this is a document the inquiry's looked at quite a lot in the course of its hearings. It's a letter from Dr. Spence Galbraith, Director at the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre in Colindale, to the DHSS dated the 9th of May 1983. You'll see if we look at the first paragraph of the letter, it contains an update of cases, including a reference to 3 cases being reported in Spain. And then you'll see in the second paragraph, it contains Dr. Spence Galbraith's conclusion, having reviewed the literature, that all products made from blood donated in the US after 1978 should be withdrawn from use until the risk of AIDS transmission by those products has been clarified. And then we can look over the page and see the paper that he sent to the DHSS entitled Action on AIDS, advocating a temporary withdrawal of all blood products and setting out a number of reasons. Now, I'm not going to go through the detail of the reasons with you, Mr. Waters, but can I ask this? Is this a document that the Haemophilia Society, to the best of your recollection, saw at the time?
We did not see it.
Had you seen it, and had you seen that the leading public health, or a leading public health official at CDSC was advocating a temporary ban, do you think that might have affected the Society's policy and advice in the course of 1983-84?
I would first of all have wanted to find out how much Dr. Galbraith knew about haemophilia itself and the results, the consequences of withdrawing all the product. Once I had satisfied myself on that, I would then listen. But what he writes suggests to me he has no knowledge of the benefits of treatment and the problems likely to arise as a result of the withdrawal of treatment, because that's what this would have led to.
Well, Mr. Waters, may I just probe that a little further with you? It might have led to the withdrawal of, would have led to a temporary cessation of the use of commercial concentrates. That's not necessarily to be equated, is it, with the complete withdrawal of treatment? There would have been both NHS concentrates on this approach and cryoprecipitate available, for example.
Not a lot is the answer. And cryoprecipitate was hardly being produced then, I feel. That's my recall.
But this is a document the Haemophilia Society should have been provided with. Would you accept by either Professor Bloom, UKHCGO, or the Department of Health?
Did Professor Bloom see the letter?
There's some evidence to suggest that by reason of his participation in meetings with the Department of Health, he may have done. If he had it, let me put it that way, if Professor Bloom had this letter, should he, in your view, have provided it or shared it with the Society?
He should most certainly have shared it with HCDO and thereafter shared it with us.
And we know the Department of Health had it because it's addressed to the Department of Health. And we know from what you've already told us that the Society had regular meetings with the Department of Health. Should the Department of Health have shared this with the Society, in your view?
I don't know how much my view counts at this late stage, but it would have been helpful to the overall cause had the information, both this information and other information, been shared more widely by the Department of Health.
The next document I wanted to ask you about from 83 is HCDO 40-270_004. You'll recall, Mr. Waters, we touched on this, I think it was yesterday, when we looked at your exchange of correspondence from mid-1983 with Professor Bloom, in which you'd asked if he wanted to update his May statement, and he responded to you saying he didn't. I paraphrase, he didn't at that stage see any need to, but he sent you a copy of this letter, and this is the letter which he was suggesting didn't need to be shared with your membership, and I think you raised a question about that.
Yes.
You've now had an opportunity to see the letter, and you can see that it refers to a special meeting of reference centre directors in May of 1983, and it refers at points 1 and 2 to two general recommendations for the treatment of mildly affected patients, patients with von Willebrands, patients with minor lesions, the treatment of children, and the treatment of patients previously unexposed to imported concentrates. Having now seen it, you would have seen it presumably at the time, but having now seen it to refresh your memory, do you think this is a document that should have been shared by the Society with its membership so that your members could know what recommendations were being given to their centres and ask questions if those recommendations were not being followed?
I rather thought we did share not the letter but some of the content in a subsequent Hemofact or in a bulletin. I may be mistaken.
Okay, well, we can check that, Mr. Waters.
Yeah.
I think there may be certainly a later Hemofact which picks up upon this. What the date of it was, I'd have to double check.
Yeah.
But would you accept as a matter of principle the broad nature of the recommendations here are recommendations that patients were entitled to know about?
Yes.
Then if we could go next, please, Shomik, to HSOC 00199923 _006. This is a council meeting from the 8th of October 1983. If we could go, Shomik, I think it's to the second page. So if we can go down the page. Yes, it's the bottom paragraph. So you'll see here, it refers to the talk by Professor Bloom at the morning session of the Council's meeting on AIDS. And then it refers to the publication Hemofact, and we can see this. The Chair spoke about the new publication Hemofact and thanked Mr. Clive Knight and the coordinator for their initiative in producing this leaflet. That would suggest you had a direct role in the production of Hemofact, Mr. Waters, and so I just wanted to ask you, by reference to that, if you can outline to us what your role was in relation to Hemofact.
My role was largely a facilitative one, in as much as I did what was necessary to obtain the articles on the directions of Clive Knight, make sure they arrived, were forwarded to him for his approval, overseeing the construction of the publication in the office and making sure that it went to the chairman for his clearance before wider distribution. Okay. But my role was not editorial in any sense.
Okay, thank you. And then building on this meeting on the 8th of October, can we look at a letter you wrote to Professor Bloom afterwards? Shomik, I've got two references, so I'm not sure which you've got, so we'll try one and failing that the other. CBLA 5060 _030. If you don't have that, I can try DHSC 301248. We can see here your letter of the 10th of October 1983 to Professor Bloom. It records that you've been asked by the Chair on behalf of the Council to write expressing deep thanks for the talk on AIDS. And then you say this in the second paragraph: as I'm sure you have gathered, this was a most useful session and did help us considerably to allay unfounded fears held by a large number of our members. I happen to know that people arrived at the meeting quite prepared to take up cudgels and create war within and against the executive committee. Happily, in the event, this did not happen, since people had aids put into a helpful perspective, which can only benefit relationships between the society, its groups and its members. Can you assist us with what your knowledge was of people having arrived at the meeting prepared to take up cudgels and create war? What does that refer to, please?
I think people arrived having collected a lot of information from the popular press, which was, of course, alarmist and designed to sell newspapers rather than necessarily convey facts, and that they were upset and wanted to know the truth.
Truth can be upsetting, Mr. Waters, can it not? And this letter appears to suggest that a motivation, perhaps a primary motivation on behalf of the society, had been to allay concerns rather than spell out full facts. What would you say in response to that?
I think the word that governs that is unfounded facts or unfounded fears. Because there were plenty of them about, I can assure you, generated in the community by schools who wouldn't accept children with haemophilia, by employers who wouldn't allow people with haemophilia to come to the place of employment, by the abuse people with haemophilia were suffering in the streets, in their homes, having slogans painted on their doors. Goodness me, all that does lead to great, great fear. And that was a fear that was entirely without foundation.
And the inquiry's heard much evidence to that effect, Mr. Waters. But was that the position as at autumn 1983, however?
Oh, yes.
And what did you mean by people had aids put into a helpful perspective?
I think I can only assume that I meant it was putting the known facts at that time to those who were present, to support them through what they were suffering in the community.
Can I ask you to look at an extract from a document produced by Professor Bloom a number of years later? It's his litigation report, where he, refers to this meeting. Again, Seamus, I've got two references. I'm not sure which is the correct one. DHSC 301297.
We wouldn't have had access to this report at the time.
No.
Of course.
No, I understand that. And Seamus, it's a very long document. I'm looking for the page numbered 174 in the internal pagination at the top of the page, please. So if we go 3 pages further on. Yes, so you'll see this is a section of Professor Bloom's litigation report which refers to interactions with he had with the Haemophilia Society. And Seamus, if we go further on to, it's page 177 using the internal pagination.
But just before you leave.
Oh, yes, of course.
What suddenly caught my eye is the second sentence on the page. The society circulated its members, and this is the first sentence, and haemophilia centres with a series of pamphlets on AIDS called Hemofact, which contained relevant information and advice. And then these pamphlets were produced by the society, but not with input from the medical advisory panel. I thought, from what was said yesterday, that insofar as it dealt with issues of treatment, medicine, and the AIDS risk, there had been such input. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, Most of them were written by members of the medical advisory panel.
That's what I thought. So this is simply untrue.
It strikes me as an untruth, yes.
Yes.
I should perhaps draw attention to the second page, to the next page.
Yeah.
Where Professor Bloom does deal with the 4th of May 1983 document and says that he drew up that statement.
Yes, but he's not dealing with the Hemophilia, is he?
No, but he's not disavowing any knowledge of that.
No.
If we then go on, Shomik, to page 177, that's it. Mr. Waters, could you look at what's said here about the 8th of October 1983 meeting? Professor Bloom, in his 1990 litigation report, says this: I addressed the council on a large meeting of the Haemophilia Society in London on the subject of AIDS. I do not have a record of the meeting or of my address, but Doctors Ritzer and Forbes were also present. I was now more circumspect than previously with regard to the role of blood products in AIDS, and suggested that until their role became more clear, it would be wise to revise dosages and for haemophiliacs to modify their lifestyle to prevent bleeding. This was met with a very poor reception by the audience. Several patients or parents spoke from the floor, and the gist of the response was that they did not wish to, nor did they intend to, reduce demands for therapy using current products. Although I received an appreciative letter of thanks from Mr. Waters, and that's the document we've just looked at, my impression is that my relationship with the Haemophilia, we can just scroll down a couple of lines, Shomik, Society changed from this date, and they sought my advice on fewer occasions. Mr. Waters, can I first of all ask for your observations on what Professor Bloom says here about the meeting itself and what he says about the meeting? He says he was more circumspect about the role of blood products in AIDS and was advising caution in relation to both dosages and lifestyle modifications.
I think it was only a month earlier he had said he didn't need to revise what he had written in the original Hemofact. And I've got no recall of this detail of the meeting at all. Nor do I think it diminished the relationship, because he continued for some time after that to hold position of chair of the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation and the Reference Centre Directors.
So you've got, you say you've got no recollection of what he says here. I don't know whether you can answer this, but do you think it's correct? Do you think you'd have remembered or recorded in some form of document if Professor Bloom was giving advice different from the advice which he had previously given the Society?
Most definitely.
And you've got no recollection in any event of this somehow changing your attitude to, or the Society's attitude towards Professor Bloom?
The Society's attitude, I would say, it did not change.
Thank you, Mr. Waters. I'm now going to return to where we were in late 1984. Shomik, could we have HSOC 002 9476 _ 041, please? These are the minutes of a executive committee meeting on the 11th of October 1984. You'll note this was at the Kennedy Hotel, Mr. Waters, and I know you've got a recollection of a meeting at the Kennedy Hotel in which you and Mr. Knight raised issues. If we go over the page, we can see top of the page is the reference to AIDS. It was noted that there was a new case of AIDS in Scotland, and then there's a discussion about response to the Mail on Sunday and an agreement that the Society's solicitors should write to the Mail on Sunday about something that they had said. Now, it doesn't appear that any action or decision or revision of policy was contemplated, notwithstanding the new case of AIDS in Scotland. Can you, do you have any recollection of that? Can you assist with why nothing else was being done at that stage?
I have no recollection at all.
If we then move on to two letters you sent in November 1984, Mr. Waters. The first is at HCDO 40677. You'll see there it's a letter dated the 14th of November 84. It's from you, and it's to all centre directors and local groups. And it's drawing attention to an article or a series of articles about the numbers who might be infected with AIDS. And you're drawing attention to various matters relating to that particular or the origin of those articles. And then you say this in the penultimate paragraph: in the United States, as in the United Kingdom, the majority of haemophiliacs tested positive for HTLV3. It's important, therefore, to remember that testing positive for HTLV3 establishes the presence of antibodies against the virus and does not suggest a diagnosis of AIDS. And two matters I wanted to ask you about, Mr. Waters, arising from this letter. First of all, this, I think, is one of the first letters we've seen in which you're not simply writing to the medical advisory panel, but you're actually writing directly to all centre directors and to local groups. Why was it that you took what appears to be a different course of communicating with that much wider audience at this stage?
I wouldn't know at this stage.
Would that have been your decision, or the chair's, or are you unable to say?
It would have been the decision of the chair that a letter like that should be written.
And then in the paragraph that I drew attention to, you say there, in the US, as in the UK, the majority of haemophiliacs tested positive for HTLV3. Now, bearing in mind, I think that many or most haemophiliacs had not been tested at all by that stage, although there had been some testing written up in a published study. Can you assist us with why you were saying in the UK the majority of haemophiliacs tested positive?
I've got absolutely no recall of this at all. What I do recall is that there was controversy and a lack of agreement on what the presence of antibodies meant.
And then there's a second letter of the same date.
Just one moment.
Yes.
Where is the confusion or the disagreement or the controversy about what an antibody status meant in the letter? The letter rather suggests the opposite, doesn't it?
It says it doesn't suggest. I can't read it. It's gone too small.
Have the bit back at the bottom. It's the penultimate paragraph.
The presence of antibodies against the virus does not suggest a diagnosis of AIDS. And that was the point that Dr. Karnoff made in a Hemofact we looked at yesterday as well.
Yes, that doesn't really answer my question, because what you were telling me, I had thought, was that there was controversy about what the presence of antibodies signified.
Well, I think the controversy possibly occurred later, because at this stage they were saying it didn't indicate a diagnosis, whereas later it became clear that it did indicate a diagnosis.
Now, just going on from that, if indeed there had been the controversy at this time, as I thought your earlier answer had suggested. You've now corrected that, I think, perhaps. Then you would have reflected that, would you, in this letter?
Yes.
That would have been your choice and not the chairman's.
A letter like this would have been seen by Father Tanner before it went out.
And by seen by, does that mean he exercised a degree of editorial control over it?
Oh yes.
Yeah.
It would have gone by fax to his office.
Yeah.
And then if we look at a second letter of the same date, ARMO 40335. If we zoom into the text of the letter a little more closely, we can see it's the 14th of November 1984, and it's from you. This is to all centre directors and transfusion centre directors, and you're drawing attention to a special report from CDC, an MMWR report about heat-treated products, and inviting responses. And if we just go over the page, please, Seamus, and we just look at the top half of the page, we can see it's the MMWR, sorry, if we can just look at the very top. October the 26th, 1984. We can go back to the letter, the previous page, please. It would appear that by this time, at least, the Society, therefore, is receiving copies of MMWR. Is that fair?
I think we would receive them spasmodically if someone sent them to us. We did not subscribe to it.
And we can see here again, rather than going simply to the medical advisory panel or Professor Bloom, you're writing here to all centre directors and all transfusion centre directors. Are you able to assist with why you've taken that wider course than simply going to the medical advisory panel?
To me, it would suggest that we were looking for a speedier response from a wider audience, rather than waiting for the next meeting of the Hemophilia Centre Directors Organisation and all the formalities entailed in that.
If we then, continuing in November 84, look at the council meeting in November, it's HSOC 00-19923_011. So if we look at the top, first of all, we can see it's a council meeting, 24th of November 84 at the Kennedy Hotel. If we go down to the bottom of the page, we can see under the heading AIDS, it says this subject had received detailed consideration at the morning session, see Appendix 1 to these minutes, and the following courses of action for groups and individuals were approved by those present. And if we go over the page, we can see at the top of the next page the courses of action. One is demand heat-treated product now from centres. This is possible on a named patient basis. Little 2, ensure the transfusion centres maintain the highest possible standards in blood collection. And 3 is immediately write to MPs about AIDS risk, heat treatment and plasma collection. And then if we look at the appendix, that's page 5 of this document, please, Seamus. No, it'll be the page after, my apologies. That's it. If we go to the top half of the page, first of all, AIDS, the chairman introduced this as the first item on the morning agenda of the council meeting. He outlined briefly the action taken by the society to date with particular reference to the forthcoming meeting with the minister. The chairman stressed that despite the media coverage of the past week, nothing underlined had changed. There's then a discussion, Mr. Knight talking about how the society had been able to use the media to make political mileage. And then if we look further down, we can see a list of the points that it's proposed to make or raise with the minister. Point 1 is about taking steps to import heat-treated products to treat everybody now. 2 was about national plasmapheresis programs. 3 was about the position in transfusion centres and advocating testing of donors. And 4 was about seeking funding from the Department of Health. Now, if we just go back to the top of the page, please. See there in that first paragraph, the chairman's stressing that nothing had changed. Do you know what's meant by that suggestion, that nothing had changed?
From this distance and with the pressure of work we were handling at that time, I have got no idea.
Does it suggest that at least that the Society's previous policy, which was treatment, the benefits of treatment far outweighed the risk of AIDS, remained at this stage the Society's policy? There's no change to that fundamental underlying position?
No change to that fundamental policy, but I wouldn't know that that's what the minute meant.
Understood.
Yeah.
And this is, it would appear, the Society is going to take the direction now of pressing for heat-treated products to be made available to all. I'm sorry, we didn't...
But it is important to remember that at this time, we were clearly involved in a media campaign, which took up huge amounts of time. In order to get an inch of space in a newspaper, you've got to give them at least half an hour, I should think. And we were still one person with a secretary.
Well, look then at, I think, the last document from 1984, which is the Hemofact number 5. That's HCDO 40675. We can see there it's AIDS release number 5. The date is the 3rd of December 1984. If we go over the page, and look at the top half of the page first of all, we see it says this. So it refers to widespread publicity about AIDS arising from the death of a patient at the Newcastle Haemophilia Centre. And then we can see 3 lines further down in capital letters, it's essential to note that despite the current publicity, little has changed. And then reference is made to the position outlined in Hemofact 4. Those are the following numbered paragraphs, and we looked at that yesterday, the Hemofact, which contained an article by Dr. Kernoff. If we go to the next page, please. We can see it says the Society has taken action as follows. Point 1 refers to a meeting with Lord Glenarthur and picks up the points we've seen in the Council meeting. And then I just wanted to ask you a little more about point 2. It says this: we have kept in close touch with our own medical advisors, other healthcare professionals, the DHSS, the MBTS, and other charities and organisations with interest in the problem of AIDS. So just pausing there, can you assist us? We know obviously, and we've explored the communications you had with members of the medical advisory panel. What other healthcare professionals had the Society been keeping in close touch with in 1984?
Nurses, social workers, and so on.
But not other clinicians, as far as you can recall, other than as we've seen mapped out in the publications that we've looked at.
We may have kept in touch with people like Tony Pinching and Richard Tedder, but that wouldn't be at the same level of intensity as we would be keeping in touch with those directly involved in the management of haemophilia.
DHSS is self-explanatory. The NBTS, what can you recall about the level of communication and liaison the Society had with the NBTS in 1984 to enable it to say that close touch had been kept with that organisation?
Well, this should be available in Haemophilia Society files, which I left in a pretty immaculate condition, considering my hasty departure. But we did have concerns about their attention to donors and how carefully donors were selected and asked questions about their lifestyle and so on. Because as we read in the council minutes, reports were coming to us that there were no leaflets in transfusion centres and things like that.
Yes, and there is correspondence in which we haven't looked at, in which that's referred to. But was there any system of regular meetings or regular liaison with the NBTS?
That would have been in Mr. Milne's gift and subject to the pressures of his own employment, of course.
So that would have been through the route, you think, of the Blood Products Subcommittee if it took place?
Okay. Yes.
B, you say continue to monitor AIDS developments overseas, especially through the World Federation of Haemophilia and World Haemophilia AIDS Centre in Los Angeles. And I just wanted to draw your attention to that in light of our discussion a little earlier this morning. As I understand it from your earlier answer, Mr. Waters, monitoring AIDS developments overseas largely meant what you could pick up at the annual Congress. Is that right? Or by November, December 84, was there more going on in terms of international liaison?
No, not a lot. The World Haemophilia AIDS Centre was the corner of Shelby Dietrich's desk, I think, and I think it would have been her office that occasionally distributed copies of the report we just saw.
C is fundraising, and then D is this: we've made a major effort to provide the media with the facts underlined about AIDS. Now, picking up on that, Mr. Waters, it might be said that if one looks at the documents, some of which we've explored in 83, 84, that one of the Society's main preoccupations had been responding to or complaining about media reports. Is that fair, do you think?
Yeah, I think, as a point of fact, we only complained about one media report, and that was the Mail on Sunday.
And then if we look further down the page, it's just below.
Could I say on point B, I would have been referring there, or we would have been referring there, to AIDS as it related to haemophilia, because it was kind of time to bash everybody, whether they were gay, whether they were drug abusers, whether they had haemophilia, and so on and so forth. And we were very keen to get away from this heavily tainted and biased approach of the media. Although, having said that, there were people with haemophilia and HIV who were also gay, and there were people with haemophilia and AIDS who were also drug abusers. But the vast majority fell into neither of those categories and were simply the victims of the products that the UK government destined them to receive.
And thank you. I just wanted to look then at what's said underneath paragraph E. We endorse, in capital letters, our earlier advice to everyone with haemophilia, however mildly affected, to continue to accept medication as prescribed by medical staff. And then there are 3 additional recommendations, which include asking for heat-treated products as soon as possible. So is this right that as at December 1984, when this publication is being sent out, it firmly remains the Society's policy that all those with haemophilia should continue to be treated essentially as they had been, but say that they should press for heat-treated products to be given to them as soon as possible? Is that correct?
Right. And we also took action on that at some time in the future that no doubt you'll draw to our attention.
And then if we go over the page, we look at the top of the next page, the Hemofact refers this current practice at major haemophilia centres in the UK is that cryoprecipitate is used in factor VIII deficient newborn infants and children under 4 years of age, and in newly identified patients never treated with factor VIII concentrates. Whenever possible, fresh frozen plasma is used in factor IX deficient patients in the same categories, and DDAVP, wherever possible, is used in patients with moderate or mild haemophilia and von Willebrand syndrome. It is, as already stated, the Society's recommendation that heat-treated product be made available as quickly as possible for all other groups of people with haemophilia. Now, I should say, Mr. Waters, the inquiry's heard evidence which might suggest that this was not universal current practice. What's the, as far as you can recall, what was the factual basis for the Society's understanding that what's described here was current practice at major haemophilia centres?
I think that understanding would have come from the statement of Professor Bloom. I can't now recall whether it was in writing or at a conference, but I think it was in writing.
We looked at the June 83 letter, which this morning, which certainly refers to some elements of this. But you think that when you say that this is current practice, it would have been from Professor Bloom that you gained that understanding through some route or another, either UK HCGO meetings or written communications?
Correct. And again, there's the strap line about talking to your own centre director.
Then, so I think I'd promised that was the last document for December, but inevitably there's one more, two more for December, I'm sorry. HSOC 0029476043. And we can see at the top it's an executive committee meeting, 6th of December 84 at the Kennedy Hotel. If we go to the next page and we look at where it refers to AIDS, it says the chair reported that there was going to be a meeting with Lord Glenarthur the following day. There's then reference to you having written to the Mail on Sunday. And then there was a lengthy discussion on the current position relating to AIDS, and concern was expressed about the apparent lack of communication between the various professionals on the subject, and in particular in relation to the reporting of cases. The chair and the coordinator are to consider setting up a meeting with the medical advisory panel to discuss those points further. Are you able to assist us with what the concerns were about an apparent lack of communication between professionals, and which professionals were being referred to?
Memory doesn't give me that at all. I can remember that there was an apparent lack of communication, and there were differences.
But between haemophilia centre directors or between others?
Yeah, between haemophilia centre directors.
And then, if we can go, please, to DHSC 40684. We can see here a reference to a press release. If we look further down the page, keep going, Seamus, we can see this press release issued subsequent to the announcement that Scottish Factor VIII had been shown to be contaminated with HTLV3 virus is embargoed until a minute past midnight on Thursday, the 20th of December 1984. And then there's a handwritten note at the bottom: please do not circulate until released by the Society advance copy. And then if we go over the page, if we look at the top half of the page, it says, press release, the Haemophilia Society drew the attention of officials at the Department of Health to its concern about donor screening in the UK some months ago. And we are therefore not surprised by the news that Scottish Factor VIII had been found to be contaminated with HTLV3 virus. Now, just pausing there, first of all, can you assist with this? Clearly, this press release was prepared in advance of its intended circulation just after midnight or on the 20th of December 1984. How and when had the Society found out about the infections in Scotland? Can you recall?
I have no recall of that at all. Possibly through our Scottish group, possibly through a centre director.
We know or understand there to have been a meeting in Edinburgh on the 19th of December 1984 at which this information was going to be shared for the first time with patients. This might suggest that the Society had some knowledge of this prior to that meeting in order to have been able to prepare a press release. Might be unlikely to have come through the local group as patients were not yet aware.
Yeah.
Do you recall, was there any direct communication that you can recall between the Society and Professor Ludlam at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary or any of the other Scottish clinicians?
I mean, we were in regular touch with all the clinicians in Scotland.
Right. But you can't recall how you came to know about this? And then, can I just ask you about we're therefore not surprised by the news that Scottish Factor VIII has been found to be contaminated with HTLV3 virus. If that news came as no surprise to the Society, do you think the Society's concerns that this might happen should have been shared with its members prior to this?
What would the benefit? Sorry, I'm not here to ask questions, but I ask myself the question: what benefit would have accrued from that sharing of information?
Patients might have decided not to treat themselves, taken an informed decision in the knowledge that their representative organisation, the Haemophilia Society, had concerns about risks of possible risks of infection.
Any medication we treat ourselves with carries risks, and I think that this press release is written in order to attract the attention of the press to it, rather than giving factual information to patients.
May I just ask about that? This isn't talking about the inevitable side effects of a treatment. This is talking about a way in which the treatment could be made safer. The purpose of donor screening, after all, is to screen out the donations which are or might well be of higher risk, isn't it?
Yes.
So that's what this is concerned with. It's concerned about taking greater protection to ensure that the product is a rather better product. It's a bit like heat treating the product in order to very significantly, one hoped, the chance that it might transmit the virus of interest.
And it was a subject that we were aware of, and we were trying to deal with directly with the Department of Health and the blood transfusion services.
So the answer perhaps is it to Council's question about why not alert the membership is that at that stage you thought that lobbying behind the scenes might be more effective than the membership generally to take part in a campaign, let their voice be heard.
Right. Yeah.
Is that the case?
That would be the case. So yes.
If we look at the next paragraph of the press release, Mr. Waters, it says this underlines the very great urgency attached to the immediate introduction of heat-treated concentrates, which the Haemophilia Society has been pressing for since early November. And we've seen some documents from November and December which refer to the Haemophilia Society's views on that issue. Can you assist with this? Prior to late 1984, in the years that preceded that, had the Haemophilia Society been lobbying in any respect that you're aware of pharmaceutical companies or others to work on measures such as viral inactivation, to work on viral inactivation measures such as heat treatment? Had that ever been part of the Society's thinking, as far as you can recall?
As far as I can recall, it was, but they were all in very early stages of development, and the effect on the efficacy of the product and things was called into question, and it was a question of waiting until the time was right to generate an effective product.
And then if we look at the fourth paragraph, it says this: while we remain of the opinion that treatment by prescribed medication is the first priority for anyone with haemophilia, based on the firm conviction that haemophilia itself is more dangerous than AIDS, in the light of the recent development of heat-treated product, we urge our members to press for these concentrates at the earliest possible moment. So is it right to understand this as being the Society's underlying message and policy was not at this stage altered at all? It remained the Society's view that members should continue to treat themselves with concentrates, albeit they should try and get heat-treated ones as soon as they could. Is that correct?
Based on the information we were receiving at that time from the Department of Health and the Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation and our own medical advisors, yes, that was the position.
And are you able to assist us with any particular medical advice or evidence that you were receiving from any of those sources in the last few months of 1984? We've obviously looked at the Hemofacts and the communications with Professor Bloom and the like, but was there any other evidential basis the Society had that led it to remain firm in its commitment that the dangers of bleeding outweighed the risks of AIDS even in December 1984?
If I hadn't been required to leave the Society at quite the speed I did leave, having been declared, my post having been declared redundant, I might have been able to refresh my memory, but not having access to documentation, I've got absolutely no recall whatsoever, and it is a little unreasonable to expect me to remember things from this distance.
I understand, Mr. Waters, you don't remember. You understand I need to ask the question because sometimes people will have recollections, sometimes they won't.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much, Ms. Richards.
Next letter I want to ask you about is a document from January 1985, Mr. Waters. It's BPLL 301351_103. We can see it's a letter from Professor Bloom, 2nd of January 1985. It's responding to a letter from you in December, 20th of December 1984. He says this: I think that our meeting went reasonably well, although some patients and families may have had their worries increased. I can't see any realistic way of avoiding this. However, like you, I'm glad that the meeting was held before all the publicity. Just pausing there, Professor Bloom, I think, is referring to a meeting held in Cardiff for patients, a group meeting in the same way that we know that Professor Ludlam held a group meeting in Edinburgh on the 20th of December. And we've heard evidence of some other haemophilia centres doing likewise. To the best of your recollection, did you or anyone else from representing the Haemophilia Society ever attend any of those group meetings that were taking place at this time in centres?
I wonder if this was referring to a group meeting or a meeting called by the centre itself.
Sorry, I misused the word group. It's referring, I think, to a meeting called by the centre, and I'm sorry, I should have clarified. My question is not about the Society's local groups, but did members of the Society, representing the Society as opposed to being individual patients, ever attend any of those centre organised meetings that were taking place around this time?
I don't think so, but my recall isn't 100%, of course.
And then if we look to the bottom of the paragraph on this page, Professor Bloom says this: with regard to the general situation regarding AIDS, the whole thing is worrying. We are in a catch-22 situation. In the past, my committee has always been under pressure from patients and from the society to seek increased funding for the purchase of commercial factor 8. And then he goes on to refer to usage of factor 8 for patients in the UK being compared unfavourably with the greater usage in some other countries. Now, this appears to be suggesting Professor Bloom saying the patients and the Haemophilia Society had pressurised Clinicians / UK HCDO for commercial factor 8. Do you have any observations on that, and does that reflect your recollection of events?
The pressure wasn't for the purchase of commercial factor 8 at all. It was for the pressure was to meet the gap between the inadequate supply from Bioproducts Laboratory and the actual need for treatment. That did entail using commercial factor 8. But we weren't pressing for the purchase of commercial factor 8. We were at the same time exerting much greater pressure in the right place in order to facilitate the development of the blood products laboratory at Elstree.
And then if we go over the page, top paragraph, Professor Bloom says this: we're now in a situation in which we're being driven to administer large volumes of heat-treated factor 8 without adequate clinical trial. We do not know the short or medium-term effects, leave alone the long-term effects of such treatment. For example, immunological effects on inhibitor development, immune complex disease, liver and kidney impairment. We do not know if these effects or indeed protection from AIDS may be dose-related. I am therefore writing in my private capacity, not as chairman of the Haemophilia Directors Organisation, to ask you to draw the attention of your colleagues to my fears. Perhaps you could consider the advisability of introducing a note of caution concerning dosages of factor 8 and free usage of heated materials until more experience is obtained with their use. You might like to solicit the views of your other medical advisors on these aspects. And then before I ask you about that, if we'll just look at the last paragraph, he says this: as a haemophilia physician, I feel somewhat guilty that my therapeutic endeavours have resulted in exposure of patients to this newly discovered HTLV virus. I do not wish to see this type of process repeated in the future, albeit with a different hazard. For this reason, I wish to draw your attention to the need for caution. I realise the desire of haemophiliacs to lead a normal life, but at the same time, one must realistically conclude that ideal treatment is not available. And then if we pick it up in the last few lines, he talks about expectations being balanced against informed reality and says, I leave it to you and your colleagues to consider the best ways by which this particular nettle may be grasped, always accepting that there is, in fact, a nettle. Now, it would appear that Professor Bloom is here expressing a desire for caution regarding the use of heat-treated products, and inviting, not on behalf of UK HCDO, but on his own behalf, the Society to take some steps in that regard. Can you recall what, if any, discussions took place within the Society in relation to the issue on receipt of Professor Bloom's letter, and whether any such steps were taken?
I've got no direct recall, but I know what the process would have been. The letter would have been copied to the chairman and the chair of the blood product subcommittee, and it would have been discussed there, and action taken as necessary. I don't know whether there's correspondence or not relating to consultation of other members of the medical advisory panel, or whether they were telephoned and if that was recorded in an executive committee meeting.
Okay, I don't know the answer to that Mr. Waters, without
Yeah.
double checking. But that's the process you would expect to have been triggered in any event by this.
That's the process I would expect to have been followed. Especially with a lengthy letter like that gives opinion on a number of subjects.
Mr. Waters, I don't know whether you can help with this. It's a more general question rather than focused on any particular document. We can take the document down, Chairman. We've seen references, for example, in the Hemofacts articles authored by Dr. Lee and then by Dr. Kernoff, references to numbers of cases and a suggestion from Dr. Kernoff that the risk in terms of numbers of cases may not be of a great magnitude. Can you recall when and how the penny dropped for the society that this was not going to be a handful of cases?
I've got no clear recollection of that at all. But again, the records should show that.
And then, if we can look at one further document before we break, perhaps, from early 1985, it's PRSE 301088.
I have great fun trying to decipher the codes that precede documents, and it's not always the code of the recipient of the document that's used.
It's not. No, it's not always. So this is a 1985 bulletin. I don't think we can tell from this version which one it was, but in any event, if we look, we can see that there's an article headed UK Self-Sufficiency Confirmed for 1986. And then if we can look at the bottom of the page, we go just a little further down, we're able to just zoom in on where it says AIDS. That's perfect, thank you. We can see it says this: although the press has been dramatising the AIDS problem and the risk of imported blood coming into this country, I think it is very important not to forget that without the imported product, the quality of life of those who need factor 8 and factor 9 would have been much poorer. And then you talk about good news. Now, this is a direct quote from you, according to the Bulletin article. We're now in 1985, the precise date I think we don't know. You're still talking about press dramatising the AIDS problem at a point in time when the society would have known, presumably, that the AIDS problem for haemophiliacs was certainly more extensive than had previously been thought. Why did you talk about the press dramatising the AIDS problem still at that stage?
I would tell you if I could recall it, but I can't. I can only imagine that it was because of the evidence presented in the press every day and the problems being encountered once again by haemophilia, people with haemophilia in the community.
Okay.
Because in those days we were still at 16 Trinity Street, I noticed, which meant there was me and one secretary, 2 telephone lines, and they rang off the wall from about 8:30 every morning until 5:30, 6 o'clock every evening. And in between times, I was required to deal with everything else.
Okay. So I note the time. Is that a convenient? We can take that down, thank you. Is that a convenient point for a break?
Well, let's take a break, shall we, until 11:45. 11:45, Mr. Waters.
Thank you.